In this section we're going to bake AO and shadow maps for everything in the scene. Changing the energy of that hemilight to 0.25 just to see if it makes a difference. Making it a little bit more gray. I'm just brightening it up since once we add shadow maps and AO maps to everything, the scene's going to be a lot darker than it is, so we might have to adjust the lights. I just selected all the windows and turned transparency on for them, so I can get a better idea of how the entire scene looks. I had turned transparency off just because it creates that glitchiness when you're rotating the scene while GLSL is enabled. Going through all the layers just to refresh myself on where everything is. I'm moving all of the pieces of the environment that I don't want to cast shadows in AO, like the decals on the wall, to their own layer, so that when we bake AO maps and shadow maps, they're not going to have any effect. It will also include the puddles and the transparent parts of the windows. So now I'm selecting the puddles and I'm moving them to the same layer as the wall decals. I move the plants into that layer too. And I just move the sheet metal to a different layer as well. Here I have the ground selected and I'm creating a new UV layer called light. Although later on I end up using the stencil map UV layer since the UV layout is pretty much exactly the same. But for the time being I add a new UV layer for the ground and I unwrap it using project from view bounds. Here I'm just moving my fake people to a hidden layer. I don't want them casting shadows either. We're going to need to add new UV layers for everything else in the scene as well. That's why we initially called all the first UV layers color, because that UV layer contains the UV layout for color maps and normal maps, specular maps, things like that, while the light UV layer is going to be used specifically for AO maps. So now with the ground selected and with the new UV layer and a new UV layout, I'm going to go to the render options, change the bake mode to ambient occlusion. I'm going to make sure I enable normalized. I'm going to change the margin to 6, and I'm going to deselect, select it to active. So I'm going to disable that. It's just going to be a regular bake. So with every layer enabled that I want to cast shadows, I'm going to go into edit mode of the ground and create a new image on the right side for the AO map to bake to. I'm going to make sure I save it before I start baking so nothing makes Blender crash. And then I'm just going to bake that AO map. So remember, I have the layer with the decals and the puddles disabled so that it doesn't cast any shadows. So this is our AO bake, and I'm going to go and save that. And I'm going to go into empty texture slot at the bottom of the texture stack of the ground textures, and we're going to add in that AO map. just to preview it and see how it looks. So I loaded in the AO image, changing the coordinates to UV, changing the layer to light. Because we're using a stencil map, we're going to actually have to have a duplicate of this light map texture above and below the stencil map texture. And now it's casting a shadow like it should be. But not on the grass because that's above the stencil map. So we're going to have to make a duplicate of this texture and move it above the stencil map. This is just a brief moment where I forgot that I have to have a duplicate of that texture. So I was playing with RGB to intensity, but I disable that, so don't worry about that. So now I go back up top. I rename that texture Floor AO. Or Floor Light, whatever. Go up into a texture slot above the stencil map, and I load in that new texture that I just created. Change the blend mode to multiply again. Make sure that that layer is enabled. For some reason it was disabled. And for that new texture that we just added in, we're going to have to also change the UV coordinates, the coordinates to UV and the layer to light. So now we have two of the same texture above and below the stencil map texture. It's unfortunate that we have to do it that way. I'm sure there's a way around that using nodes, but that might use up a little bit more resources. So now we have ambient occlusion for our ground. And the texture setup is easy. Just change coordinates to UV, change the layer to light, and change the blend mode to multiply. And that's all you need to do to apply an ambient occlusion map to your object. Now we're going to use these light maps to affect our specularity. Because we don't want any specularity in the dark areas, and to make the AO map affect specularity, all you have to do is simply enable color under specular in the influence panel. And make sure RGB to intensity is disabled. I don't know why I keep enabling that thinking it's going to affect something, but I'm just playing around with the material settings, trying to get the best look I can. So now with the AO map having color enabled for specular, it's going to show specularity in the brighter areas while not showing any specularity in the darker areas. Now we're going to unwrap the walls. I'm going to do the same thing by adding a new UV layer called Light. I'm going to unwrap all those UVs again. And I'm going to separate them all. I'm going to take here half the wall on each side and rotate it upside down so they fit together like puzzle pieces, just to conserve more space on the texture map. And now I'm going to squish everything into this UV space using every single inch that I can. It doesn't matter too much if the UVs are a bit stretched here, since we're not using this for a color map, we're using this for a light map. It's okay if they're stretched a little bit. The important part is to use every single pixel of space that you can. Now with those same settings, ambient occlusion, normalized, margin 6, I'm going to make an AO map, again with those layers with the puddles and the wall decals disabled so they're not casting shadows. So I baked that AO map. I'm going to save that in the textures folder as walls AO. And this texture is going to be easy to add. Just at the bottom of the stack, add a new image texture called walls AO. Load in the walls AO image. Change coordinates to UV. Change the layer to light. Change the blend mode to multiply. And it will apply the image. Now we just have to make sure that this texture affects the specularity. All we have to do there is enable color under specular in the influence panel. Now our walls have an AO map. We're going to be baking shadow maps as well from the 5 lamps that we have in the scene. And we're going to be mixing them in Photoshop with our AO map. And here I'm just playing with different settings for the spec map and the normal map. Now that I can see the wall with shadows, and now that I can see everything with shadows as I'm baking the shadows onto them, I get a better idea of what it's going to look like as the final product. So as I'm baking these maps and applying them, I'm also going through and changing a few settings here and there to see if I can make all of these textures look better. Like here I was turning down the specularity for the ground. I was expecting the shadows to drown out the specularity a little bit more than they did. So the ground ended up being a little bit too shiny. So I just turned down the specularity a little bit. Now I just went into game mode and I noticed that the textures on the ground are screwed up. This has something to do with UV layers. And instead of trying to figure out how to get 3 UV layers working together in the texture stack, I'm just going to simply get rid of the light UV layer, and I'm going to use the stencil UV layer for the light maps. But since the stencil UV layer has a UV layout that is somewhat different than the light UV layer we just created, we're going to have to make some changes. First thing I'm going to do is go through the textures, and I'm going to change the layer in the mapping panel to stencil for the 2 light map textures. And now, since the UV layout is a bit offset, as you can see, we're going to have to rebake the ambient occlusion map to the AO image. So I'm going to go into the stencil UV layer, so in edit mode with all of the faces selected, I applied the floor AO image to those UVs by loading it into the right window. Now we're going to rebake our ambient occlusion map. Make sure that the floor AO image is applied to these UVs because that's what it's going to be baking over. And we don't want it to bake over our stencil map. So with the floor AO image applied to the UVs and the stencil UV layer enabled, I just rebaked that ambient occlusion map and I saved it again. Here I just noticed that that piece of sheet metal on the ground had 2 sides to it, so I just deleted one side. Now for all the lamps, I'm going to enable ray shadow in the shadow panel. And I change samples to 4. I'm going to keep everything else as is. Should I change sample to 5? I'm going to make the same changes for the other 4 lamps. Not the hemi light, just the 4 hanging lamps. Enable ray shadow and change samples to 5. Now we're going to bake some shadow maps for the ground and the wall and mix them with the AO maps. So with all the vertices selected, I'm going to create a new image, 2048 by 2048. I'm going to change bake mode to shadow. I'm going to change margin to 6 and leave everything else the same. So I baked the shadow map and I saved it. I'm going to open up both the AO map and the shadow map, and I'm going to blend them together. I'm going to paste the shadow map onto the AO map. I'm going to desaturate those colors because it turned out blue. We're going to change the blend mode to multiply, and I'm going to lower the opacity so that the shadows aren't so dark. Before I lower the opacity, I pull it in the blender to see what it looks like. Then I go back and I make some changes. So I reloaded that image back into Blender. Now I lower the opacity to about 80%, just to lighten up those shadows a tiny bit. So reload that AO image. And now we're going to bake a shadow map for the walls. So create a new image, 2048 by 2048. And we're going to bake shadows the same way. And we're going to mix the shadows with the AO map the same way. So now we have some shadows casted on the wall. And here I started having more trouble with these stupid pieces of sheet metal. For some reason Blender's screwing up the normals. So I select all the vertices of all the center sheet metal pieces. I press W for the specials menu and I select remove doubles. So now all of these pieces of sheet metal are just one-sided, as you can see. So now we have a bunch of one-sided pieces of sheet metal. We're going to fix this problem once and for all, and then we're going to bake the AO maps and the shadow maps for them. But while they're still one-sided, I selected all of the sheet metal lining the walls as well, and I joined them together as one mesh. We're going to bake them in a second. But first I'm going to go through for all the windows, and I'm going to select the window panes, and I'm going to separate them by pressing the P key. And then I'm going to move all the window panes to a hidden layer. So go into edit mode of each window, select all the faces for the window panes, press P to separate them, and then in object mode, press M to move them to a hidden layer. Now with the sheet metal selected, add a new UV layer called Light. Press the U key with all the vertices selected, and select Unwrap. It'll give us a bit of a mess. So I'm going to press U key and I'm going to try Smart Project. Here I'm just wondering how to unwrap them better. Here I just want all of the pieces of sheet metal in the center selected, not the ones along the wall. So with all of those vertices selected and just those vertices, we'll press Shift and D to duplicate them. This new group of sheet metal pieces, I'm just going to move above the environment. And with those selected, I'm going to press W for the specials menu and I'm going to flip those normals. And now I'm going to re-unwrap everything and select Smart Project. I'm going to separate the selection that was floating above the scene, and I'm going to move it down back to its original position. And then I'm going to move it to a hidden layer. So our sheet metal is essentially two-sided now. There's just one side visible at the moment, because we have to bake one side at a time, else the faces are going to intersect and make some really bad looking shadows. So again, what I did was select all of the center pieces of sheet metal. I duplicated them and moved them up away from all the other pieces of sheet metal, and then I flipped their normals. Then I separated them into their own object. I moved them back down into their original position, and then I moved them to a hidden layer. So now I'm baking ambient occlusion for that first group of sheet metal. I'm going to save that as sheet metal AO. You can see there's lots of gaps in the AO map. It's because there's still more pieces of sheet metal in that hidden layer we have to bake. So add a texture for this the same way we've done before. Change coordinates to UV, layer to light, blend mode to multiply. Don't forget to load in the sheet metal AO image. And enable color for specularity. I'm going to deselect all of the pieces of sheet metal along the wall so that just the center ones are selected, and I'm going to separate them into their own object. And I'm going to move this sheet metal that we've already baked the AO for into a hidden layer, and I'm going to enable the layer with the other pieces of sheet metal, the ones with the flip normals that we separated earlier. Now we'll just bake AO for these, and we'll have a complete AO map for our sheet metal. I'm not going to create a new image for these. I'm just going to make sure that I turn clear off. So in the render buttons, make sure clear is disabled, else it's going to clear the AO map you just baked. I'm going to change the margin down to 3. So you can see our AO image was not cleared, it was just rendered on top of. So now our AO image is complete. The margin was a little bit too big. It started overlapping pixels on other pieces of sheet metal. So I changed the margin down to 1 and I rebaked it. And it's still overlapping, as you can see. That black border there is pixels that were just rendered from the recent bake. Because even at a margin of 1, there's still a lot of overlap because all of UVs are really close together. The sheet metal turned out to be kind of complicated. Maybe not complicated, just a little tedious. Here I'm just going through and I'm looking for any stray pixels. Just making sure that the AO map is baking correctly. So we need to rebake this one last time. I'm going to turn margin down to 0 so that there's no way that the margin from this bake is going to overlap the previous bake. I'm going to enable both layers with both sides of the sheet metal. I'm going to go through and make sure that nothing is overlapping. I mean, so that none of the shadows are overlapping. Then I'm going to save that as sheet metal AO again. We'll preview that in game mode and everything looks good. Now the sheet metal in the center looks really weird when you're just scrolling around in the 3D view. It's because it's two-sided. Now we have basically two pieces of sheet metal with normals facing in opposite directions in the same exact position. So in 3D view with GLSL, which is a little bit glitchy still, it's going to look glitchy. But in game view, everything looks right. So in edit mode of the first group of sheet metal, I'm going to create a new image, and we're going to bake shadows for this now, the same way we baked shadows before. I'm going to put margin at 2, bake mode on shadow, and then I'm going to bake. Remember, we still have a hidden layer with the other pieces of sheet metal for the center to bake to. So I'm going to save that as sheet metal shadow. And once we're finished baking the shadow map for these pieces of sheet metal, we're going to mix it together with the AO map, and then we'll be finally done with these pieces of sheet metal. I'm going to separate the middle pieces of sheet metal yet again. move them to a hidden layer. So I enabled the hidden layer with the other pieces of sheet metal facing the opposite direction, and I'm baking the shadows for them with margin at 0 and clear disabled in the render buttons. So that completes our shadow map. And we just have to mix that in Photoshop with the AO map, and we're good. I'm going around the scene and pressing P to play the game. Make sure everything looks good in game mode. Now we're going to bake all the pieces of wood in the environment. The reason I'm going to join all these pieces of wood together is because they all have the same material. So that's going to make adding a AO texture for them a lot easier, since I'll only have to do it once. So I'm going to go through, I'm going to select all the pieces of wood that share the same wood material. And I'm going to join them together in one mesh. I'm going to create a new UV layer for them called light. And I'm going to re-unwrap them. Everything I have selected, I'm just moving away from the scene to make sure I didn't miss a plank or two. I just saved a different copy of the blend file, just in case I find that joining them together it was a mistake, and I might not be able to undo it, because Blender kind of crashes sometimes when undo. So I created the new UV layer, and I'm unwrapping all of the UVs using the Unwrap tool. Everything's pretty tightly packed, but otherwise looks okay. Right there I just tried using Smart Project, but I end up going back to using Unwrap. So in the bake options, I'm going to change bake mode to ambient occlusion. I'm going to enable normalized, enable clear, and change the margin to 5. I'm going to create a new image, 2048 by 2048. I see one of the faces a little bit screwed up on the wall there. I just fixed that real fast by triangulating it, which would be to select a quad, or 4 vertices, press Ctrl and T, and it'll change that quad into a triangle, or 2 triangles actually. So with all of the UVs applied to that new image we created, I'm going to enable all of the layers that I want to cast shadows on all of these planks and pieces of wood. Then we're going to bake ambient occlusion and then bake shadow maps, mix them together, and we'll be done with this. Create a new texture called Planks AO. Load in the Planks AO image. Change coordinates to UV. Change the layer to light. Change the blend mode to multiply. And let's see how it looks so far. Also for specularity, don't forget to enable color under the specular settings. And things are really starting to shape up now. I just baked a huge chunk of the environment. Alright, select all those vertices again, create a new image at the same size. We don't want to clear the old image, so make sure that the UVs are applied to a brand new image. Change the bake mode to shadow, and let's bake shadows for all these things. Alright, there's our shadow map. Let's save that, and let's go into Photoshop and mix them together, and then we'll go back in Blender and reload that AO image with the updated shadows. You can see that some of the nails actually casted shadows in the AO map. If I would have rendered the AO map bigger, all of the nails would have been casting shadows, and we could have gotten rid of the nail meshes, which was the original plan. But it didn't really matter to me at this point. Now it's just a matter of going through, rendering maps for the roof and all of the props. So we're going to work with the roof now. We're going to do the same thing we did before, create a new UV layer called light, create a new image for that UV layer. And here I'm just going to use the previous UV layout, and we go through and Tetris everything together. We're going to bake AO and bake shadows and go through the whole process again. There I just joined all those loose pieces of plywood on the roof with the roof mesh so that I could bake all of these together since they have the same material. And I'm just going through and I'm squeezing all these pieces of plywood in with the roof UVs. Now I have to go through and I have to rebake everything. And it looks good. I'm going to save that as roof AO. I'm going to create a new image applied to those UVs. And we're going to bake a shadow map now. Again, make sure that the new image is applied to the UVs, else you'll be baking on top of your AO image. Alright, with the shadows baked, let's mix these together now. Save that as roof shadow. Pull both images into Photoshop. Save that as roof AO and reload it in Blender. I just jumped in game mode and the roof looks pretty screwed up. All of the textures are correct. Oh, don't forget to enable color for specularity on the roof. All of the textures for the roof are correct. The way I fix this is kind of stupid. I just duplicate it and I delete the original mesh and it works. I'm not kidding. So here you'll see me go into game mode to preview the problem. And it's a weird looking problem too. The UVs are all screwed up. So I get out of game mode. I simply press Shift and D to duplicate the roof like I did there. I select the original mesh and I delete it. And now I go back in game mode. And it works. Another stupid little Blender glitch, but easy enough to fix. So keep that one trick in mind. If one of your objects is screwed up, before you spend an hour trying to figure out what's wrong, simply duplicate it and see if that works. Now all that's really left is the props. I actually don't even end up baking the windows. I just make their material a little bit darker to blend into the corners. and it totally works. So you can get away with not baking everything in the scene. Not everything has to be baked. Not everything needs an AO map. And then not everything needs a separate AO map. Like for the hanging lamps, how we mix the AO map in with the color texture itself, you can do that for a lot of objects as well. So I selected the plywood and the doors. I move them to their own layer. Now all of these instances have to be made into real objects before we can edit them and bake them. So press Ctrl plus A for a menu and choose Make Duplicates Real. It's going to create real objects out of those instances. It's going to leave us with a bunch of leftover empties we have to delete. Now to get rid of all of those empties now, I went up into the Select menu and selected All by Type. So with one of the empties selected, if you select All by Type, it'll select all the other empties and then you can simply delete them. Now these objects are real, but they're still not meshes we can edit. They're still linked to the blend file, so I had to select them all and duplicate them, and then delete the originals, and the duplications, or the duplicates, they're all editable now. But now we still have to make them all single users. I selected the wrong option there. You have to select them all, make single user, object, and obdata. So to change an instance into a real editable mesh, you have to select that instance, you have to convert it to a real object, then you have to duplicate it and delete the original. Then you have to select the duplicate, go into the object menu, and make it a single user with object and obdata. So now I joined all of those props together. I'm going to create a new UV layer called Light. And with all the vertices selected, I'm going to press U and select Unwrap. Everything is unwrapped pretty well because we still maintained all the seams in our objects. I'm going to create a new image at 2048 by 2048 applied to those UVs. Now we're going to enable all the layers that we want casting shadows on these props. I'm just going around the scene making sure that all of the props were in that group. I'm selecting that plywood and the doors and I'm joining them together. I'm going to create a new UV layer called Light, and I'm going to join them with all the other props. So now that's one big mesh. I'm going to re-unwrap everything. Now for some reason it left the plywood UVs floating on top there, super big. So I'm going to mix them in manually in a second after I create a new image for those UVs at 2048 by 2048. I'm just going to go and I'm going to find some room to put all these plywood UVs. I try unwrapping again, but nothing changes. So using the L key to select an island of UVs from these pieces of plywood, I separate them all. I'm going to scale them down and squish them in here somehow. Again, I'm going to enable all the layers I want casting shadows. We still have that one hidden layer. And now we're going to bake an ambient occlusion map for all of these props. This should be the last batch of bakes that we do. Now in the bake options, we're going to change bake mode to ambient occlusion, enable normalized, and keep the margin at 5. And bake. Once that is done baking, we can save that image as props AO, and we can add a texture to all of the materials within this mesh. And we have quite a few. I go to the roof material first and I click on the plus sign next to it to create a new material called plywood. Then I go to the textures and I get rid of the existing AO map, which was for the roof, and I create a new texture called props AO. And I load in the props AO texture map. The reason I created a new material is because the roof and the plywood both shared the same material, but the roof has a different AO map. So now select the next material and change all the settings the same way. Now for materials on objects that are linked in from external blend files, like our props, before we can edit those materials we first have to make them local. So select the material, and next to the material name there's a little icon with an arrow. Click on that and that makes the material local. And now we can change things and add new textures. We're going to have to do the same thing for all of our prop materials. Now create a new image for those UVs, and then now we can make a shadow map. So with our shadow map baked, save that as props shadow, and let's mix these together and reload it.